The critics of the Fed are numerous, as I said. And the recent criticism has erupted because a few weeks ago, after warning of about 3 or 4 months by the chairman of the Federal Reserve that interest rates were going to go up. And lo and behold, he did. The overnight interest rates that banks pay to borrow money just to adjust their books went up 1/4%. This is very disturbing to the markets. But Alan Greenspan mentioned this for 3 or 4 months. He started talking about the threat to the marketplace and the threat to the stock market back in December. But instead of him being entirely in control as he would pretend to be, actually market interest rates were already rising. Because if we look carefully at the monetary statistics from from December up until the time he raised interest rates, he actually was doubling the growth of the money supply. What does this mean? This means that there were pressures already on rising interest rates, and the way you keep interest rates down is to create more and more money. It's a supply and demand effect. So if you have more money, make it more available, interest rates come down. So this was his attempt to keep interest rates down, rather than him saying, oh, today we have to have higher interest rates. But the real problem is why does the Federal Reserve have this much power over interest rates? In a free market, interest rates would be determined by savings. People would be encouraged to work, spend what they want, save the rest. If savings are high, interest rates go down. People then are encouraged to borrow and invest and build businesses. But today, we have created an environment that there's no encouragement for savings, for tax reasons and for psychological reasons. Very, very little savings in this country. Our country saves less money than probably any country in the world. But that doesn't eliminate the access to credit. Because if the banks and the businesses need money, the Federal Reserve comes along and they crank out the credit and they lower the interest rates artificially, which then encourages business people and consumers to do things that they would not otherwise do. And this is the expansion or the bubble part of the business cycle, which then sets the stage for the next recession. So people can talk about how to get out of the next recession when the next recession hits, and they can talk about what caused it, but the next recession has already been scheduled. It's been scheduled by the expansion of the money supply and the spending and the borrowing and the deficits that we've accumulated here over the last 6 to 8 years. And so therefore we can anticipate, and we in the Congress will have to deal with it, we anticipate for the next recession. But unfortunately, because we don't look at the fundamentals of what we have done and the spending and the deficits, the next stage will be what we've done before. That is, if unemployment's going up, government has to spend more money. There has to be more unemployment insurance. We can't let people suffer, so the deficits will go up, revenues will go down, and as we spend more money to try to bail ourselves out of the next recession, we will obviously just compound the problems, because that's what we have been doing for the past 50 years. And we have not solved these problems. Matter of fact, what has happened, because we eventually get the economy going again, what we do is we continue to build this huge financial bubble which exists today. It's a much bigger bubble than ever existed in the 1920s. It's international in scope, and it's something never experienced in the history of mankind. And yet we have to face up to this, because when that time comes, we have to do the right things. The 64 members of Congress recently that signed the letter to Alan Greenspan said, Mr. Greenspan, you should not raise interest rates. Of course, I just mentioned that maybe interest rates were rising anyway. Maybe he was accommodating the market pressures. But when 64 members of Congress write to Greenspan and said, don't let interest rates rise or lower interest rates, what they're really saying is crank out more money. Because if there's a greater supply of money, then interest rates will be lower and everybody's going to be happy. That's true for a short run. On the long run, it causes very serious problems. Stiglitz, who used to be the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, is a very strong critic of Alan Greenspan right now. And he said that there are no problems. There's no cliff we're about to go over. Don't worry about the future. And I don't fault Mr. Greenspan's concern, believe me. I think he knows what's coming and why adjustments have to be made. But his critics are saying, when they talk about don't raise interest rates, what we have to remember is what he's saying, what they're saying to him is make sure there's more inflation, more money, lower interest rates, and of course that will add to our problems in the future. Not only do we have members of Congress telling the Fed what to do, and former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors telling them, many others all have an opinion on what to do, but nobody really asks the question, why are they doing all this in secret, and where did they get all this power, and why do we tolerate this system of money? Even the IMF, something I'm very much concerned about, is the internationalization of our credit system. The IMF now has issued a recent report, but they don't agree with the 64 members of Congress, and they don't agree with the critics who say lower interest rates create more money. They're saying to our Federal Reserve, you're creating too much money, and you're having too much growth. Who ever heard of anything like too much growth? What's wrong with too much growth? Well, some people think that too much growth causes inflation, which is an absolute fallacy. If there's a lot of growth and a lot of production, prices would come down. Prices go up when the value of the money goes down. But they're saying, the IMF, that shouldn't even be involved in our domestic policy, and are more involved than ever before, they're telling our Fed, this is good, what you're doing is good. Keep raising your interest rate, turn off the economy, have a little slump here. We don't need that kind of advice from somebody. We have enough problems taking advice from our own people and our own Congress about what has to happen, but we certainly don't need the advice from the IMF telling us that we ought to have more inflation, that we should avoid overheating, and that for some reason growth is bad. In a free market, sound monetary system, growth is good. If you have sound money and you have economic growth of 6 or 7 or 8% a year, you don't have inflation. That doesn't cause the inflation. It's only the debasement of the money that causes prices to rise. Why do we hear so much concern about interest rates and prices? Well, there's a specific reason for this, according to some very sound economic thinkers, and that is they would like us here in the Congress to think only about prices, either the price of money, which is the interest rate, or other prices. Because so often it leads to the conclusion that, well, maybe what we ought to do are have price controls, which they tried in the early 70s, and it was a total disaster. But this is essentially what we have in medicine today. We create new credit. The money goes in certain areas. The government takes this money and channels it into education and medicine. So you have more price inflation. So what do? You have price controls. And that's what's going on. That's what we're having today in medicine, rationing of health care. That's what managed care is all about. Patients suffer from this because they have less choices, and they don't have as much decision-making on what care they're going to get. But this is a consequence of government manipulation and government manipulation of money and credit. The reason is they don't, those who want to perpetuate the system don't want us to think of the real cause. And that is, the real cause is the monetary system. They would like us to think about the symptoms and not the cause, because it is in the interest of a lot of people. Not only in the interest of the big spenders here in the Congress, who love the idea that the Federal Reserve is available to accommodate them on deficits, but there are business and banking interests and international interests and even some military production interests who like the idea that the credit is readily available and that they will be accommodated. The little guy never benefits. The little guy pays the taxes, he suffers from the inflation, he suffers from the unemployment, but there's a special group of people in an inflationary environment that benefits. Today, of course, there's a lot of people on Wall Street benefiting from this environment. Now, if this type of system was real good, we would all be very, very prosperous. And if we listen to the government statistics, we would say there are no problems in this country. But I know differently. A lot of people I talk to, they tell me they're having a lot of problems making ends meet. Sometimes they work 2 or 3 jobs to get their bills paid. And it's not all feminism that makes women go to work. A lot of women go to work because they have to do it to make ends meet and take care of their families. So there are a lot of problems. But one key issue key point that I think is important, and that is economic growth. If we have no economic growth and there's no productivity growth, we can't maintain the standard of living. We can't have increase in wages. If you don't produce more, you can't have wages going up. Unfortunately, that's where we're really hurting in this country. We're living prosperously because we borrow a lot of money by individuals, by corporations, and our government borrows a lot from overseas. But we're not producing. Productivity growth in the last 5 years has averaged 0.3%. This is very, very low. It's equivalent to what happened before the Industrial Revolution, and it's going to lead to major problems in this country unless we understand why we are not producing as we had in the past. And we need to do this. We need to address this if we have any concern about the people who suffer from these consequences. The economic growth is slow. Predictions are that they're going to even, according to the government statistics, are going to slow even more. That in time, whether it's the end of this year or next, we will have a recession. Even by some government statistics now, we are seeing signs that there is a rising price level in some of our commodities. They believe that there's belief that these prices will go up, and we will be suffering more so, even measured by the Consumer Price Index. This story that is being passed out here in the halls of Congress and in other places in Washington, that we don't have to worry about the Consumer Price Index, it overstates inflation, therefore we can make the adjustment. I don't think that's correct at all. I think the Consumer Price Index probably way underestimates inflation. If you have private sources, there are many people who suffer a cost of living much higher than the 3 or 4% that the government reports. But there are some commodity indices that in the past 2 years have gone up over 50%. This is a sign of the consequence of the inflating of the money supply, and it's starting to hit some of our consumer will hit some of our consumer products because it's already hitting our commodities. This idea that if there's a sign that prices are increasing, what we have to do is take it under control, and we have to suppress economic growth and raise interest rates. You know, this says something about our policy that shows the lack of understanding. Because if you look at all the recessions that we have had since World War II, in spite of the seriousness of many of these recessions, prices still go up. And the one that we remember most clearly is in the 1970s, where they even coined the word stagflation. This is not an unheard of economic phenomenon. It's very frequent in many other nations where you have a lot of inflation and poor economic growth. We've not had a serious problem with that, but it is very likely that's eventually what we will get, because we have absolutely no backing and no restraint on our monetary system.